Well, hello everybody. Once again, this is your host, Brad Blazar, on the Learn To Soar series and the Learn To Soar podcast, where we also host, of course, the Mega Producer and the Build-A-Bear coaching programs. I tell you what, man, I am so excited today to be here in Dallas, Texas with the wonderful Evan Stewart. You'll find today, this is a man that is obsessed. You can actually see it right here on his shirt. But Evan Stewart is a master strategist, a trainer, and an expert closer with years of experience running his own multi-8-figure book of business and helps other people do the same. He's recognized as a leader in personal and professional development. Evan's expert guidance has actually scaled companies over 1,000% to multiple 7 and 8 figures, and his personal mentorship has been coined the invaluable element anyone needs to fortify their mind and attack their aspirations. He is a consistently sought-after advisor to thousands, helps motivate professionals, and helps them gain a competitive advantage, and his expertise on driving referrals, mastering objections, and fostering a bulletproof mental resiliency, working with high net worth products and clients, and breaking down sustaining obsessions, just to name a few, are topics that are in demand. From upper management and ownership to starting staff and sales and professionals alike, Evan's private clients receive tangible and actionable knowledge with the sole purpose of elevating their life and their earning potential. Absolutely. Evan lives here in Dallas with his beautiful wife, Whitney. He's an avid mountain climber, an avid rock climber, and a person that's absolutely obsessed. Evan, welcome to Learn To Soar.
Oh, man, thank you so much, Brad. I'm so excited to be here. I mean, look, you've got an amazing setup. You've got an amazing podcast. I love your content. I love your audience. And really glad that we can share some time together and bring value collectively. So thank you for having me. I really appreciate that.
Oh, you're so welcome. You're so welcome. I want to talk to you today about your past and how you became obsessed, because you came to where you are today in your career through a rather unusual course, obviously starting in the real estate industry, but being very successful. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your past and what it means to live a life of obsession?
Absolutely. Well, there's two different sides of my past. There's the professional side, and then there's the rest of my life. And they've intertwined a lot, but there have been many times where they haven't. And so from the professional standpoint, I've always been entrepreneurial. Even when I was really young, I used to go with my parents and buy those big boxes of fruit snacks at Costco or Sam's or something like that, and then I would, not for individual resale, but so then I would resell them for $1 a bag or something like that. But I remember actually I was in kindergarten and first grade, and I would be reselling fruit snacks on the playground so I could have a little extra cash to go and buy toys and stuff like that. And then all throughout elementary school, and I would do little things like that. In middle school, I started a lawn mowing company, which ended up turning into a larger landscaping company. We serviced a lot of the homes in our neighborhood, and then I sold that to a high schooler. When I was in high school, I started a technology resale company, hired people like my principal, assistant principal, chemistry. My chemistry teacher actually said at one point she was making more money working for me as a salesperson than she was actually as a teacher. And then I eventually sold that and went into consulting. So I basically did a lot as an entrepreneur, and then eventually worked my way into real estate. But the obsessed side of me, I always had this creative outlet, this need to impact. And even when I was doing something, like right now, obviously, it's with a diligent focus with Obsessed Academy about helping people earn more, do more, be more with substantial and tangible information. There's a diligent focus on helping other people achieve. But even before that existed, back when I was younger, I would do something and then immediately go and help somebody else do the same thing. So I would, with the landscaping company, right, for example, I started the landscaping company, and then I helped other people start landscape companies.
Gotcha.
And so I would always go back, and so I've always had this obsession, not to overuse the word, but this intense drive and desire to really help inspire, impact, and improve the lives of other people. And that has played in and out throughout the entire course of my life, and now it's just, I'm blessed to be able to do both, have a professional and a personal alignment.
Wonderful. No, absolutely. Now, obviously, somebody that came to the Obsessed event and has actually talked to you before. We invited you onto the podcast.
Sure.
There's a difference between healthy obsessions and unhealthy obsessions.
Absolutely.
Can you speak to that for our followers?
Absolutely. Well, the concept of obsession that I talk on is not this, phone up at 5 a.m, like I hate the gym, but I'm here anyway, and it's freezing outside, but I'm taking the ice bath. And there's this concept of obsession which actually stems from what I call the unhealthy obsession. Because there's a difference between healthy and unhealthy, like you said. And the unhealthy obsession is what we hear a lot of in the media. It's a lot of the hype. It's a lot of the people that go down specific trajectories. But it usually stems from really dark places and negativity. And so the example that I used at the Obsessed conference, which for those that are listening is what Brad is actually referencing, was I'd heard a story recently about an individual who's unfortunately got a divorce, and his wife started dating someone who was significantly wealthier than he was, and just kind of all around a little better physique and all of that. And so this individual started working really long hours at the office, started going to the gym and doing all these things that on the outside people would say, oh, you're starting to get back into personal development and all of that. But in reality, he was developing obsessions with getting better, earning more money, because he was trying to overcompensate for feelings of shame and guilt and loss and abandonment. And so the end of that is only a lack of fulfillment and regret. The end of unhealthy obsession is only a lack of fulfillment and regret. And so many people focus on the mania of obsession, which leads to unhealthy obsessions. But the other side of that is healthy. You see, I believe that obsession is a cycle. It's first in emotion, it's next to mindset, and it's third in discipline. Emotion is a stage of revelation. This is where I recognize that something needs to happen. Okay? The mindset is a stage of preparation. I know through the emotion that something needs to happen in my life. Therefore, I'm preparing my mind, my body, and my spirit. I'm working my land. I'm making things happen. And then we move into the third, which is a stage of cultivation. Now we're going to build, build, build. We're going to reap what we sow. And then we go forth into what everyone is chasing, which is obsession overflow. And the overflow is the abundance of the obsession. The healthy obsessions where I feel that there's a calling on my life, where once I've heard that my purpose is needing to change, I can no longer look at my life the same way again. And therefore, I start moving in a divine purpose. I start moving with obedience, a long obedience, in a very specific and concise direction towards a greater calling that usually has a positive impact on those around you. That's the type of obsession and the narrative I'm trying to create through Obsessed Academy in helping other individuals build a life they can be obsessed about. It's not this frou-frou, hey, you need to get up and hustle. No, there is a calling on your life. There's a hand and emotion on your life that we all know exists, but my narrative starts with what happens if we listen and take action on that.
So many people that are watching, that are out there, watch podcasts, read self-help books, and they get what I call temporarily motivated. Probably temporarily obsessed. Where they start doing something and then all of a sudden that obsession or that motivation fizzles out. It doesn't become a lifestyle. It doesn't ingrain through the muscle memory and doing it on a regular basis. One of the things that I teach is you got to create habits. Over time, those habits create muscle memory, and what happens is you now have a new direction and a new course of life, because now that habit is something that you do every day. Whether it's fitness related, whether it's learning more, whether it's relationships spiritually you have with somebody else. How does somebody stay obsessed consistently and move in the direction basically where they have long-term obsession rather than something that is just temporary?
Well, what you talked about right there is people that stay in the emotion, which is the first stage of obsession. Because a lot of people, and that's what I'm trying to define, because a lot of people know that it fizzles, but they don't know why. The reason why is that they're not moving. Right? I say that emotion, it is literally a recognition, moving. It is as soon as I know, I choose not to be a victim, and a victim is a positive or a negative affected of something, right? So something happens in my world, gives me a revelation. A revelation is not God coming out of the sky and saying, Brad, your life is different. A revelation can be you notice something, and for whatever reason, it hits you deeper. And there's a distinct paradigm shift in how you recognize that thing and your world. It collides, and you realize something needs to change. That's a revelation. And so you have that moment of revelation, but the thing is that most people stop. You see, what I'm trying to encourage individuals, and this answers your question, is when you have that moment of revelation, you hear something in your mind, that nagging, that internal knowing that something needs to happen. You just simply start moving. My very first principle is commit first, figure it out later. And it's not blind commitment.
Love it.
It's just as soon as I have enough information to make an adjustment, I will adjust, because I know that if we're in motion, it's easier to move. And so the thing is, most people get stuck in the emotion of obsession because it feels good to be hype. It feels good to feel good, right? Zig Ziglar said that motivation is like showering. It doesn't last. That's why we need it daily. And that's the thing, is that individuals that are staying in the emotion, they're always going to conferences and listening to podcasts, and they're wanting to do more, and they're going to be better. I mean, you know people. To the listeners and those that are watching, we all know people who are always about to be better or do something great. But they never actually do it because they love the mania. They love the emotional high. It's like a hit of a drug that stays with them. And the problem with sustaining obsession that I want to make all the listeners aware of is that that emotional high does wear off. But it wears off with a distinct certainty in your spirit, because when it wears off, it now becomes, this is a part of who I am. And that becomes so deeply ingrained in your spirit, it's very hard to be emotionally attached in a very high way to that, of the mania and the excitement, the highly caffeinated, anxiety-ridden emotion, because there becomes so much purpose that it becomes much more serious and somber, right? I say, you're living in obsession when you lose the obligation. When you lose the obligation to emote in that way is how it starts. But you have to move, like you said, the habits. You can't get caught in the minutia of feeling excited. You have to start moving from that moment of revelation and recognition.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I find as I talk to people, basically there are three types of people. There are the blamers that blame their lack of success, their lack of everything on somebody else. There are the dreamers that, like you said, dreaming, constantly getting reinvigorated, reading, going to these podcasts, but they never move forward. Those are the differences, I say, between the entrepreneurs and the wantrepreneurs. And then there are the game changers, those guys like you or me that are going to figure it out. And I tell people that I coach that want to start a business or want to be more entrepreneurial, you don't have to have all the answers. Trust me, when I started my oil company at the age of 23, lacking a formal college education, I did not know the first thing about running a multi-million-dollar company, but I knew my CPA did, and I knew my attorney did. I put together that mastermind group and that power team, and I grew that company, and I scaled it over almost a decade. People will figure it out along the way. Now, you talk about something that is rather interesting called the law of harvest. Can you touch upon the law of harvest for our listeners and explain exactly what that is and what that means to you as well?
Absolutely. And this, it's definitely not something that I invented, right? The law of harvest goes back to ancient and even biblical standards, but the law of the harvest is just the general recognition that at some point you will reap what you've been sowing. So you need to make sure that, number one, you're sowing consistently, and number two, if the harvest that you're going to reap will happen, you will reap regardless. You want to make sure that it is something you will be excited to reap. Because there's two different types of reaping. There's the reaping that you're forced to do where your hand is moved, and there's the reaping that you choose to do where you move your hand. There's the reaping where you're stuck because you've chosen bad decisions. You consistently live in the emotion of obsession. Your life becomes mundane, mediocre, and you're forced to an example of a mundane reaping or a mediocre reaping is you have an amazing, smart as a whip daughter that grows up and says, "Dad, I want to cure cancer and go to MIT," and you say, "I can't pay for that." And now her future can't happen because of your decisions now. That is a reap right there. That is a reap of your labor. It's just a negative instead of a positive. Right? The law of the harvest is you work your land now. And I talk about this. I actually just talked about this in another podcast a couple of weeks ago, which is there are moments that you're working in right now that can be utilized and leveraged later, right? Because having faith that your future is coming, the better future is coming, sometimes it's having faith that maybe you need to stay put, in addition to having faith that maybe you need to move. Both of them can be very important tests of your faith and your obsession. But sometimes staying put, the example that I used, I think is really important. You might hear, okay, well, I want to go and be a musician. I want to go and do these great things, but I'm stuck here checking out people at 7-Eleven because life happens and I got to make this work. That's a reality, right? Well, now think about it instead of I'm stuck here and I can't work in this way and oh, my life is... Now it's, well, now you have an opportunity to make 30-second or less impressions with 1,000 people a day. And you can master the craft of being an immediate impressionist to make sure that you walk away from every conversation leaving a stickiness in their mind so they remember your face, your name, and what you're about. So now it's a chance to develop your conviction around immediate moments of people you'll never interact with again. Now it's an opportunity to leverage that. So if you want to go and maybe be a musician, you and I both know that in that space, working with high media individuals, you have moments to make an impression. Well, now you've mastered the momentary impression because you've spent 3 years, 1,000 people a day going through your convenience store, making momentary impressions. And so bringing that back to the law of the harvest, the example there is working your land where you're at, because if you remember that you will reap, you want to make sure that the seeds you're planting are going to produce a harvest that you're excited to reap.
Makes sense. Absolutely. Totally agree. Now, explain to me, I guess, where you came up with the idea of the Obsessed Academy and kind of coining that phrase, obsession. Was it something that you developed yourself? Did you study with other trainers and coaches? Was it through readings and learnings? Obviously, you're very knowledgeable on the subject, but where did you come up, I guess, with this concept of obsession? Of course, my concept, the art of beliefology, is something uniquely different, which is if you change your beliefs, you can change your future. Yours is, of course, leading a life of obsession.
Yes.
Yeah. Where did that come from?
Well, yes to everything, actually. A little bit of everything, because I believe that the best ideas and concepts are put out there, tried, refined, educated on, fail, and then re-implement. And so I was thinking back on my life on something that I now call, I didn't have a name for it at the time, but I now call threads of consistency. And a thread of consistency is a core sense of your humanity that hasn't changed regardless of the environment that you're in. So my thread of consistency I already touched on was my need, my internal need to inspire, impact, and improve the lives of other people. Like I said, regardless of what I was doing, I'd start a landscaping company, I'd help other people. I'd start playing piano, I'd help other people. Everything was about helping another individual elevate their life. How does their life get better now that I'm in it? And then making that so. So that was my thread of consistency. But there are things in my life, you remember from the Obsessed Conference, one of them being my musical background, where I kept hearing this term come again and again, as I would call people that I hadn't spoken to, who was I as a child? And these terms kept coming up, and one of them was, you were just obsessed about X. You were obsessed about this business, you're obsessed about this, because my personality is to go all in as deep as I possibly can, and commit fully, commit first, but also commit fully. And that word kept playing around in my mind, and I actually shoved it off initially because of the stigma. Now I've talked about unhealthy obsession, but because of the stigma, which I hadn't defined yet, I didn't want to be associated with a word like obsessed. Because when you think of obsessed, you think of drug addiction and sexual addiction and the things that we don't want to be obsessed about, right?
Right. The 7 deadly sins, as I call them.
Exactly. And so I started exploring this topic, and I started exploring how it played into my life and my spiritual life and my faith, and how it played into my businesses. And I recognized that it was the truth. And so I have great mentors, and silent mentorship is a term that I call when you're learning from someone through their content, but you've never actually met them. So I've got actual mentors, and I've got coaches, and I've got silent mentorship, and I started just diving deep. And one day I was actually in very beginning of 2018, I was getting ready to start putting a name and a face behind my coaching and consulting, because over the last couple of years I've been privately consulting, but I didn't have a concept that I worked behind. And that name just literally in a moment came, and I was obsessed. And so I typed it out on a Photoshop because I was working with a designer to put together some content. And it just looked good, and it felt good, and it sounded good, and I started putting it out there, and it immediately gained traction. And I started thinking, okay, and then from there we worked out through this idea of Obsessed Academy and whatnot. But for the person that's listening on this, not to just continue talking about my life, but to give an actionable and tangible thing to take away from this, it was the art of positioning through a specific concept instead of a self. So look at your podcast, the Learn To Soar Network. So many people want to know how they can soar in their own life through refining their beliefs, how their future can change their beliefs. The first thought is, okay, well, that sounds easy. I know it's not, but I want to know how. Right?
Absolutely.
It's easy to understand.
Yeah, it's a concept.
Exactly. But see, more people are going to connect with their lives soaring than they are with the Brad Blazar show.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
I mean, realistically, that's just it. Unless you're somebody of such high influence that your name supersedes who
Sure.
all of it,
Absolutely.
which most of us aren't. And so that idea stemmed from those threads of consistency, but it also was, what is one big concept that love me or hate me? You don't have to love me in order to be a part of that program,
Right.
in order to be a part of your life getting better, right? How can I impact the lives of other people, whether or not you resonate with who I am as a person? Now, my hope is that you do, but it's my responsibility to change your life regardless of if you resonate with me as an individual.
Love it. Love it. Yeah, I mean, it's funny, you know, in the book and, of course, in the coaching that I do, I tell people there are two types of people. There are chickens and turkeys.
Yep.
You find them in flocks, right? They've got their head on, buck, 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 buck. And then there are eagles. You never hear about a flock of eagles.
Yeah.
Eagles are predatory birds. They're flying around one at a time, right?
Yep.
And that's the concept,
Yep.
is you want to be
Yep.
soaring. You want to be the one eagle that's soaring in the skies above everything else. You don't want to have your head down as a chicken or a turkey trying to figure it out.
Yes.
Now, tell us about this thing that you're doing called the Obsess Conference that's tied to the Obsess Academy. You just had a phenomenal event. I was there
thank
with
you.
a couple of other coaches. Great day of just immersing myself and learning not only from you, but some of the other top coaches across the country. What is it you're trying to accomplish, and what are the plans for doing this again?
Absolutely. Well, we've got some big plans. We're going to go much, 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 much bigger. Immediately after the event this year, we had a meeting with, that night, after the conference, I had 3 meetings with the team, and the next day we already had things set in motion.
I love it.
And so, but the Obsessed Conference follows that concept of building a life you can be obsessed about through healthy obsessions. So it's an opportunity to intimately close gaps between you and people that were previously untouchable. It's an opportunity to learn from individuals that are providing amazing content in a way that hasn't been heard before. It's not just some, event where you can go and you can just be better and you walk away motivated, but you walk away with life-changing things, tools, keys that you can implement immediately. And so this year, it was the first one. We had the Obsessed Conference in July. Next year, it's going to be in October. It's not announced yet, but the website will be refreshed here in just a little bit, obsessconference.com. It'll be October 2 to 3 in Dallas. I'm not allowed to announce speakers yet, but we do have speakers lined up. And if you thought last year was good, this next year is going to be unbelievable. Some powerhouses that I'm really blessed that we're able to get. But really, it's just an experience. You know, like I mentioned earlier, I'm driven by that concept of how does your life get better now that I'm in it. But from a professional standpoint, one of the questions that I'm consistently asking as a professional is, what is the experience that I can provide that the consumer cannot get anywhere else? And that's the same question that we're answering with the Obsessed Conference, which you got a taste of that. Obviously, the speaker lineup, obviously, the community is very different. You know, the environment, the experience. How can we duplicate that, create that intimacy on a much, much, much larger scale, but also give you an experience that you literally cannot have duplicated elsewhere because my hand isn't on it? And that's the goal that we have, and next year it will be accomplished on a much larger scale. And
looking forward to it.
I'm really excited. I'll have to show you some things when we get off here and give you a little sneak peek.
10X, everybody. The next Grant Cardone right here sitting next to me.
That's right.
You know, here in our country and probably around the world, we have a huge problem. And I think it's a problem that we as coaches and speakers really need to work on solving, and that is the high divorce rate.
Oh, yes.
You know, you look at relationships and so many broken homes and kids that are being raised by two parents. How does a couple lead a life of obsession? I know in your business, of course, your beautiful wife, Brittany, who I met, you guys are working together.
Yes.
I have my own beliefs on what it means to be a partnership and find a passion, but what is it that a couple can do to actually lead a life together that is obsessed?
Absolutely. Well, and I love the fact that you touched on that, because Brittany and I will be coming out with our own content about how two driven people can drive together instead of drive apart. Build a life that feeds itself instead of eats itself as a uniform grouping together of you, your spouse, and the people that you care about. And so the biggest thing is, well, first of all, I just looked out with Brittany being the director of operations for our companies, is because she's just damn good at what she does. I mean, she is,
that helps.
It really does. I mean, I was telling her, I said, literally, if she went anywhere else, I mean, she would be a $500,000 or more employee. I mean, she is so good. But we've been together for 7 years, and our lives have changed a lot during that time. And we've gone through highs and lows together, but there are a couple of key things that I really fundamentally believe. The first is that early into our relationship, we immediately started with communication. And I know that sounds a little bit kind of cliche, but I'll explain the tangible behind that. When we first sat down, I've always had a higher intensity, and I don't like to waste my time. And Brittany loves telling the story, but we sat down and I just said, look, I think you're beautiful, I really enjoy you, but we either break up or get married, and I'm not interested in making friends. So like, let's go in. Let's go in.
Talk about the prey drive.
The very first.
You saw what you wanted, and boy, you went right after it.
That's right. The very first date, we had a lunch. I mean, it was like a random afternoon, just like over a burger lunch on a tray, and I was like, here's the deal. But that opened the door where the very first week of our relationship, I mean, literally from first, like the day before it was nice to meet you.
Yeah.
The second day I said that. The first week we're talking about religion and money and sexuality and all of these things that you have to dive into. Like day 2. Do you want kids? What happens if we can't have children?
Sure.
I mean, we're going into that the first, like everything.
Wow.
The first week, the second week she met my parents, that type of thing. And so because we immediately opened the gate for this high level of communication, there wasn't anything to hide. Where when I was struggling, I could say, this is a problem I'm having. And when she was struggling, she could say that as well. And that actually alone was one of the big drivers that kept us together, because we didn't have to put up a wall or a mask. We never had to pretend for one another. Now, whether you do it from a protection of yourself or a protection of the other individual doesn't matter. The fact is that you're protecting something when in reality you should be releasing the veil and communicating at a really high level.
Sure.
And so if you're in a relationship where you haven't actually developed that, the first thing I recommend is just sit down and start saying, okay, this needs to happen. We need to be able to speak completely freely on everything. Because what happens, Brad, is life gets good, and then it doesn't. And then I lost my first business. And I remember in particular, I had built it up. It was about a $13 million company at the time. And one day, I had it all. And the next day, I had put so much money into the company. I hadn't bought a new car. I hadn't bought a new bed. I was living in a crappy apartment. It was just pour into the company. I actually had a futon for a bed. And I remember leaning back on this lumpy futon, literally just like crying like a child, just lost everything.
Sure.
I walked out of that business with 11 grand.
Wow.
And
wow.
The freedom to sit down with who was my girlfriend at the time, of course, before we were married,
Sure.
but to sit down with Brittany and just experience that and go through that together. The problem with a lot of couples when you have those veils that are up is you walk, but when you need to be together most, you start to walk your own path, which means you're leaving the other person behind. The second thing that I think is important is the book, The 5 Love Languages. I'm a big believer in the 5 love languages because you need to know how the other individual communicates, right?
Yeah, Tony Robbins talks about that, you bet.
Oh, it's so important. And there's love languages for business, how your employees communicate, but, is my spouse a gift giver? Is she someone that needs words of affirmation? Is it physical touch? Should I have my arm around her? Things like that where you can develop communication in the way that they best receive it and vice versa. That way, all of your actions inadvertently go towards affirming the relationship instead of deflating the relationship. And those two things, I mean, we can talk about that. We could have a whole show on that, but those two things in particular are some of the most important for two driven people because it is so easy to drive apart where you start thinking, okay, we're competing. We've had this rule where it's you and me against the problem, not you and me against each other.
Sure.
And again, that just stems from having that freedom to be able to have that communication through the good and the bad. That is one of the main things that has kept us so tight, even tighter as the years go on and on. Yep,
absolutely. It's funny, in my own life and, of course, in the lives of others that I've talked to, when you move in a new direction, the people that know you sometimes are the closest people in your life, your family, your friends, people that are co-workers. They kind of look at you and they roll their eyes, right? Yeah. They're the naysayers, like, you're doing what nowadays?
Yeah, sure.
And they kind of look at you rather funny. But after you get to a certain point of success, they become some of your most loyal advocates. Are like, wow, this guy over here knocked it out of the park. Look at him today, multi-million-dollar guy driving the new Mercedes, living in the $1 million home. And all of a sudden, those people that were naysayers, that were trying to pull you and tear you down because they didn't believe that you were able to achieve that level of success, now see you as that successful person.
Absolutely.
That's living a life of possession. Now, does that trickle down as well to children as well? Because, I'm working on, of course, the Build the Beast. I know there are speakers and trainers that realize we have a huge problem in our country, not just the divorce rate, right? But the fact that I say today, kids are being raised by these damn things, the iPads.
Yes.
Right? You see them all the time. I'm working with a couple of coaches actually to do things for kids that are between the ages of 8 to 12 and then kids that are going from high school off to college.
Yep.
So they're better prepared. What can you tell us that kids or parents might use as it relates to working with children so that they're obsessed, they're not being raised by their iPad, and they're really motivated to be the best that they can be as well?
Oh, a couple of different things, actually. I think in speaking into the iPad and the technology, I actually have a little bit of a different slant. I believe that we don't need to get rid of the technology. We actually need to embrace it. But the problem that you're explaining isn't the fact that the technology exists, it's that the technology is replacing the guidance and the mentorship and the parents.
Yeah.
And so, but when we talk about how do we build our kids up in a way, the first one is you've got to stop living your life through your children, right? And that goes back to our initial, I don't believe that living a life you can be obsessed about is something you should do. I believe it's your moral and your ethical obligation to all that you care about.
Sure.
Because what happens is if my life is poor and mediocre, I start to fix it through my children, and that may not be their gift. My gift may not be their gift. And so when we're working with younger people, we have to so deeply foster and allow them to push creativity. You see so many times, for example, it's, oh, Dad, I want to go and play the violin. Oh, you don't need to play violin, you need to play guitar because I should have been in a rock band, right?
Sure.
Well, what happens is I encourage the creativity, the creative process. Oh, go ahead. Like, let's go down that rabbit hole. Because the great thing about kids is if they don't like it,
they'll
they
figure
won't
it out
do
quick.
it anymore, right?
Correct.
I was gonna go, I want to go to soccer camp. Well, then we're done with soccer. But you can go through that and you can start to explore and you can foster that sense of creativity and exploration and kindness and guidance and allow that person to start to find what they really are excited and obsessed about because that will trickle through the other areas of their life. And I think that's so important. I'm not talking about just a general, you go live your life and whatnot. I do believe in having specific guiding principles in the family. Obviously, at some point you need to parent. You're not there as a friend to help someone find their way, but you're there as a parent. But I'm not talking about, building them as a good or bad person. I'm just talking about in this space of finding interests in particular, of going out to explore those interests and allowing that creative space to be there. I see so many parents that are like, oh, well, my kid will never. Okay, well, but what happens when that kid really wants that thing that they'll never? They really want to play violin instead of guitar, and now they're fostering a sense of almost anger and animosity towards you because now you're not the parent that's helped them. You're the person that's squashing what they're trying to go for, and it just goes down that it's just a really almost slippery slope of if we just gave a little bit of grace and space and allowed the creative process to work in the minds of the most gifted generation that's coming out right now with all its knowledge and technology, I think we could see a massive paradigm shift in how the world actually operates in another 20 or 30 years.
Wonderful. I tell you, this has been exciting. Like you said, I could go on for hours.
Sure.
It's been great hosting Evan Stewart from the Obsessed Academy. I'm sure that a lot of our listeners and followers are going to want to learn more. What's the best way for our listeners and followers to connect with you, Evan, if they want more information?
Of course. Well, I'm always on social media. You can find me at Real Evan Stewart on social. Those are all my handles. My website is going through a massive revamp, so it should be up by the time that you get, the time that this releases, but it'll be obsessedacademy.com. And for those that are interested in this type of content, I know you're going to be on my show. I do have a podcast on iTunes and Spotify called the Obsessed Podcast. And you can just Google my name, Evan C. Stewart Obsessed Podcast, and you'll find it, where we dive into the anatomy of obsession with tools that can help individuals build a life they can be obsessed about. So all those areas, I believe in accessibility and try to make myself available for those who need it.
Great, great. Well, again, folks, this is Brad Blazar, the host of the Learn To Soar Network, with Evan Stewart in the studio today. We touch upon all things human performance, where we bring you great thought leaders from sports, business, and politics, to people that have gone on to accomplish great things, like reaching the top of the world, Mount Everest. Of course, Darren Miller, the world's greatest endurance swimmer. Next podcast, the wonderful, amazing Rock Thomas. I'm so excited to be hosting this guy. Stay tuned for that. Here we are, closing it out once again on another Learn To Soar.
Oh, thank you, Brad.
Fantastic, buddy.